So, in our last video, we learned how to find the slope of a line. And the slope was kind of the first quality or trait of a line that we talked about. The way of differentiating lines by looking at how steep they are. Two more qualities that lines have are x and y-intercepts. So with this picture here, I don't need you guys to copy it exactly like it looks. Like, it's not that important. But you should try to draw them somewhat similar. Just sketch a few lines right here, but they don't need to be perfect. Two vocab words I'm going to use this picture for are x-intercepts and y-intercepts. So an x-intercept is where the graph hits the x-axis. Picture if x is a football player, where he intercepts the football. Like, picture this line right here is a football flying through the air. This is x right here. He's going to intercept that football. X is right there. That is an x-intercept. It's where the graph, this graph right here, hit the x-axis. I'm going to go ahead and make my other x-intercepts in purple as well, so you can see them. If I'm looking at this line right here, it hits the x-axis right there. Actually, it's the same x-intercept for this other line too, because it's still in the same spot right there. And if I keep going right here, this line intercepts the x-axis like right there. So those purple dots are x-intercepts. And I'm going to go ahead and just for the fun of it, write down the coordinates of those points. -1, -2. This point appears to be about -4, 0. This guy right here is -2, 0, and that happened to be the same for both. And this guy over here, 1, 2, 3, 4, I can't say for sure what that is. I'm going to go like 4.7, 0. If I were to draw another line, maybe like this, the x-intercept would be right there at 2.5, 0. Ask yourself what all of these points have in common. They're all on the x-axis, yes, but what about their coordinates? And you should be able to say, well, hey, the y-coordinate on each of those points is 0. The second number is always the 0 there. That's a really big deal, and something I want you guys to write down. So on the x-intercept, y is always 0. X-intercept, the y-coordinate is 0. So I'm going to switch over to the y-intercepts now. And the y-intercept is where the graph hits the y-axis. So I'm going to trace those points, or mark those points in red. This graph hits the y-axis right there. This graph hits the y-axis here. This one's there. And finally, this one's up here. So those red dots are my y-intercepts. And if I look at the coordinates of these points, this might be 0, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. This is 0, 5, 0, -2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Maybe 0, -6.3 or something like that. But the important thing is, if you look at those points, all of the y-intercepts have a x-coordinate, the first number, of 0. So when you're on a y-intercept, your x is always 0. So it's the opposite variable that's equal to 0. So I'm going to do an example on the next slide here that hopefully will tell you why this is important and how you can actually use it. So that's just looking at a graph, and you can sometimes eyeball what the intercept is. Sometimes, though, they'll give you an equation, and they'll ask for the intercepts of the equation. So first of all, note to write for yourself, to find an intercept, plug in 0 for the other variable. If I'm looking for an x-intercept, I'm going to plug in a 0 for y, and vice versa. So, if they give you an equation like right here, they ask for the x-intercepts. The x-intercept means I plug in a 0 for y. So I'm going to do that in red right here. I get 0 equals 4x minus 5. And my job is to solve that equation. Just get x by itself. So I add a 5. 5 equals 4x, and I divide by 4. I'll end up getting 1.25 for x. So the x-intercept, and kids do this all the time. They'll write down 1.25 and be done with it, which isn't the worst thing in the world. But if you want to be official, and I definitely will correct this, maybe even take off little points if you don't, an x-intercept is a point. If you look on the last slide at all these points right here, it was x-intercept was number, 0 for y. Number, 0. You're going to write it as an ordered pair. Well, the x was 1.25. That's what it says right here. And the y, you plugged in a 0 for y. So it's 1.25, 0. Now I'm going to go ahead and find my y-intercept. For the y-intercept, I'm going to plug in a 0 for x. So I'm going to get y equals 4 times 0 minus 5. 4 times 0 minus 5 is just negative 5. So my y was equal to negative 5. That's what it says right there. And my x was a 0. So go ahead and try out this second problem for yourself. Find your x and your y-intercepts. Okay, x-intercept is going to plug in a 0 for y. I get 3x minus 6 times 0 equals 12. 3x minus 0 equals 12. I get x equals 4. So it's going to be 4 comma 0. And for my y-intercepts, I'm going to plug in a 0 for x. When I do that, 3 times 0 just goes away. So I get negative 6y equals 12. I get y equals negative 2. So my y-intercept is 0, negative 2. If I were to graph this equation right here, this is where it would hit the x-axis, this is where it hit the y.